And welcome everybody. Brother Dan Goodman here. You're watching Prophecy News. We're glad that you stopped by to visit with us today. We're glad you're here. And of course, you can reach me at daniel@godsfinaljubilee.com. Rex will put that email up there. If you are interested in a prophecy conference with me, if you'd like to talk to me about that, send me an email. We'd love to do a prophecy conference with you and your group. We have in the studio again Brother Gary Kyle. We had a great time last time. Let me introduce the program here with some thoughts about the one world government that's coming. You know, Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7 are both talking about the same four world governments. There are four world governments: Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, and then Greece took over, Alexander the Great, and then the Roman Empire became the one world government. Well, the Roman Empire faded away somewhere around 500 something AD, but it never really went completely away. The Roman Empire is still here. We're part of it. And people say, well, America's not. You know, we came from Europe. America came out of Europe, and we're kind of like the lion's cub. And I believe we're going to be part of that revived, what I believe is the revived Roman Empire that's going to be the one world empire at the end of things. And after the rapture, after we're gone, the one world system will completely be in place. There'll be a one world financial system, one world political, one world dictator, the Antichrist. There'll be a one world religious church headed up by a religious leader, I believe right out of Rome. And all that's in place right now. And Brother Gary, good to have you with us again. We left off last week. We talked about the one world political system and all that, and we're talking about that a little bit now. But we're gonna shift gears. But before we do, you talked about the one world system, and you mentioned in the last program Donald Trump is kind of a monkey wrench that was thrown into this thing, and we didn't get to talk about that. And I want you to hit on that. You said you got a quote from Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I don't want to put too much emphasis on one person as if somehow they're going to stop this whole thing or anything like that. I'm not saying that, but to be sure, they didn't see him coming along, and he has thrown a wrench into their plans. And he has come out openly and taken a stand against world government. And I've got a few excerpts from a speech he gave to the UN General Assembly on September 25th of 2018, last year. And listen to this carefully, it's quite amazing. President Trump said, "America will always choose independence and cooperation over global governance, control, and domination. I honor the right of every nation in this room to pursue its own customs, beliefs, and traditions. The United States will not tell you how to live or work or worship. We only ask that you honor our sovereignty in return. We will never surrender America's sovereignty to an unelected, unaccountable global bureaucracy. America is governed by Americans. We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism. Around the world, responsible nations must defend against threats to sovereignty, not just from global governance, but also from other new forms of coercion and domination. Sovereign and independent nations are the only vehicle where freedom has ever survived, democracy has ever endured, or peace has ever prospered. And so, we must protect our sovereignty and our cherished independence above all." End quote. Powerful quote coming from a U.S. president. So there's no mistaking where he stands on this, and I believe that's one reason why the deep state, these globalists, socialists, absolutely hate this man.
Yeah.
And, you know, we can disagree with some of the things he says and how he says it, but policy-wise, he definitely is trying to defend our national sovereignty, and
right.
Kudos to him on that.
And whether people like him or not, or like his demeanor, or his past dealings, I believe God put him in office for such a time as this. And I believe God has his hand on him. And I believe mainly for the nation of Israel and for the end-time events that have to be in place. I believe God put him there, and there's no other explanation. I mean, it's really interesting when you look at the whole system and how this happened, and he has really thrown a wrench in the gears of the whole system.
Well, considering how much attack he's been under and what he's accomplished in the last 2.5 years despite all that, it really is amazing. It is.
Moved the embassy to Jerusalem.
Right.
I mean, shocked the whole world. I mean, it happened, and look how fast it happened.
Yeah.
Remember they said it was going to cost how many millions of dollars and how long it was going to take? He cut that
He moved
thing
in a few months. I saw it a few months ago when I was over in Israel. We saw it from the back side, you know. The personnel's there. And
Nobody else could have done that.
No.
There's something about this, and his name, Trump, the last Trump. And there's a lot of other things about him, too, but we won't take the time. We go all day. There's a lot of funny scenarios and interesting numbers with his birthday and taking office and all that. Him and Bibi both. But you're very passionate about this, and it seems like it has to do with something you tell about your mom and dad. Tell us that.
Well, I was born here in the States 3 years after my parents came over from Europe. My father, as a young man, age 12, fled from the Nazis and communists in Croatia when they were converging on that country. And he became a refugee. He and his family lost everything they had. They had about 1 day's notice, 2 days tops, as the armies were closing in. And so they packed a few bags, threw some pots and pans on the back of a wagon and ran.
Your dad was from what country?
Croatia.
Really?
He was from Croatia. And so they traveled in and out wherever they could around enemy fire, and then about a year later the war ended, and they ended up high in the mountains of Austria.
Wow.
Where they found a bit of refuge in a place. And then he finished out his high school years there, and then was able to make it into Germany during the post-war recovery period because he could speak a dialect of German that he learned in Croatia. And so his goal was to save up enough money. They're working to be able to come to America, which had been his childhood dream. Well, while in Germany, he met my mother, who grew up under Adolf Hitler.
So she's German.
She's German.
Wow.
She came from the southern part of Germany, about an hour from the Swiss border. Beautiful area, from a small village of 300 that was predominantly Christian. And my grandpa was very outspoken against Hitler to the point where on one day, on one occasion, the secret police showed up at the mayor's office in the little village looking for my grandpa. And we believe the local school teacher, who was a Nazi, did him in and ratted on him. And so the mayor of the city, being a friend of the family, he sent the secret police off to a neighboring town and then found my grandpa and told him they were after him. And so he had to hide out in the forest for a few days till the coast was clear. And so my mom grew up with a lot of tense situations, you know,
Wow.
as a young girl having to deal with that type of thing. But I heard these stories growing up. And so I thought, wow, you know, how could that have happened in a country like Germany that at one time had so many Christians? You know, I mean, the Bible was first printed in Germany.
Right, it was.
And the Reformation took hold there, you know. And so I made a commitment when I was in 6th grade, sitting in my classroom in Kettering, Ohio. It all just gelled. We had a history lesson that day that dealt with World War II, and between that and what my parents had shared and what I learned at family reunions, it just all crystallized. And I remember praying to the Lord, God, if I am ever in a situation like what happened in Nazi Germany, where that were to happen in this country, I promise to you I will take a stand regardless of the cost. And I really meant that. But, you know, at age 11 or 12, you don't really think the Lord's going to take you up on something like that someday. But he did. And I'm convinced that it was the Lord himself that opened up the door for me to work for the government of the state of Indiana, that led to me traveling around the world, dealing with our foreign embassies and learning about developments underway, moving us in the direction of this one world government.
Wow. Now, your parents, are they still alive?
My mother passed a couple of years ago. She lived to be almost 90 years old, and my father is going to turn 88 this year. He's still alive, and he still has a good memory. He still talks about some of the things that happened to him along the way, and it's hard for us to imagine, you know, as a 12-year-old. And his dad died the same year. So suddenly he became the man of the family. You know, he had a lot of responsibility on him, and they had to make a decision of what to do, and they left it all behind and ran for their lives.
What year did they come to America?
Not till 1956.
Okay.
But when he fled Croatia, that was in 1944.
Right.
1944. And they were sponsored over then into the country by an uncle who lived here in the United States and then made citizenship. So they did it all legally.
You give your dad our best. I don't know if he'll watch the program
I will.
or not, but
He
I love
certainly
stories
will.
like that. Those are heroes. Those are great people.
Yeah. He's been like a rock in my life.
He
and
knows
I'm
what.
very grateful.
See, he's a man that knows what freedom is.
That's right.
People today don't understand liberty. They don't understand what
and I wish I
it
would have
is.
had a chance to meet my grandfather, my mother's father, but he passed before I was born because he was a very courageous individual to speak up the way that he did. And I believe had they lived in a big city, he probably wouldn't have made it. They would have gotten to him. But he was in a small village that they left alone until toward the end of the war.
Folks may be wondering what does this have to do with globalism? Everything. Hitler was going to bring in the Third Reich. He was going to bring in the kingdom. Yeah. He was going to head it up. And nothing's changed since the Tower of Babel. Men have always come on the scene wanting to rule the world. And it's going to happen one of these days. It hasn't come to fulfillment yet, but it's coming. And we can see it coming. Yeah. Now, in the last show, we talked a lot about the institutions and things. I understand in this book we're going to learn about some people. And so let's look at one. One of the people you mentioned in the book, by the way, the New World Religion is what we're talking about in the program today, Brother Gary's second book. And let me just read a paragraph back here. The New World Religion presents insightful clarification between authentic biblical Christianity and the occult teachings of the New Age. Boy, we hear that all the time now, the New Age, by explaining the religious underpinnings of a dangerous yet rapidly growing movement. And there's more there, but I'll stop there. So within that, I think there's a lot of people you mentioned in the book. I guess we're going to deal with, can I say that name? Helena Blavatsky.
Yeah,
did I get it close?
She's best known as Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. It's quite
That's
a mouthful.
That's worse. I'll stick with this one. So you're telling us she had influence on Hitler.
Yes. Helena was involved in the occult from a very young age. In fact, when her mother was on her deathbed, one of her final statements went something like this: "At least I'll be spared seeing whatever happens and becomes of Helena." Already at a young age, she was into some bad stuff.
All right, explain for the audience. We hear the occult all the time.
Yes.
Explain what the occult. What do you mean when you say the occult?
When I say the occult, it has to do with religious practices that emanate from the demonic realm.
Okay.
In other words, these are things that are practices strictly forbidden in Scripture.
Okay.
And I give a lot of passages in my book that deal with passages of Scripture like Deuteronomy 18:10-12 that warns people from becoming involved in things like this. And so Blavatsky eventually ended up being in regular contact with the spirit realm. You're talking about fallen angels, demons, that type of thing. That was reflected in her writings. And here on page 24 of my book, I have one of the front covers of one of her early magazines called Lucifer Magazine.
She's not trying to hide it, is she?
She wasn't trying to hide it then. She was one of the leaders along the way of the Theosophical Society. This was in the late 1800s, 1887 to 1897. You would have thought
she'd have got stoned for that back then.
You would have thought so, but remember, this was subterranean. This was not publicly advertised. This was circulated among people who shared the same beliefs.
No Facebook.
Correct. And you know, these were people who agreed with her, and they're the ones that read her magazine. And but like I said, she was involved in the Theosophical Society, which over the years has been very instrumental and had a huge impact on the New Age movement as a whole. But she wrote a book, an occult classic called The Secret Doctrine, and it's still available today. And that became like a Bible to Adolf Hitler. He was introduced to theosophy by some of his advisors who were heavily involved in the occult, and he just ate up The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky's book. And so a lot of people don't understand that Hitler wasn't just a dictator motivated by power and politics, political control, but there was a religious element that motivated him. And a former Satanist, I'll never forget this, shared with me years ago. We were both speakers at the same conference. And he said that Hitler actually believed that for every Jewish life he was able to snuff out, it would empower him that much more with occult power to be able to push his agenda forward.
Wow.
And Christians were right there as well, Bible-believing Christians. And one of the untold stories is that hundreds of thousands of Christians were put to death in Germany right alongside the Jews. Yeah. And so, I mean, this man was incredibly evil, demonically influenced, and he was a type of, a prototype of the coming Antichrist. I mean, he wanted a one-world regime, and it would have been very hostile toward Christians and obviously toward Jews. And so there's a connection there with the Theosophical Society and Helena Petrovna Blavatsky.
Did they ever meet, or is this just through books that he was
It was through books. I believe she died somewhere in there. He was already born, but I don't believe that they ever met. It was just through her writings that he was introduced to
You
it.
may not know the answer to this. There's a rumor that that his mother had an affair and that Hitler was half Jewish. Have you ever heard that? Any truth
I've heard
to
that rumor. I haven't spent the time to research that, to look into that, so it may be true, it might not be. I don't know. But somewhere along the way, he developed a strong hatred for the Jews. And something else, to show you how superstitious he was, how spiritually, in a negative kind of way, when I say spiritually, occultically inclined he was, he brought several dozen Buddhist monks to Berlin, and their assignment was to meditate on his behalf around the clock. I'm talking about occult meditation here.
Wow.
Because he believed that would, again, help protect him and help give him the power and energy to bring in the
occult version of prayer
Third
warriors.
Reich. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, Hitler believed in that very much so. But we know it all imploded on him in the end. But as a result of everything that happened during World War II, what happened afterwards? The United Nations was established. And people need to be aware of that. After the World Wars, the first one, it led to the forming of the League of Nations, the first big political step publicly toward the beginnings of a world government. And then after World War II came the United Nations. So I've always felt personally, this is my opinion, that there's going to be some type of, at the very least, major conflict in the Middle East, if not a world war, and possibly this one world government being ushered in on the backside of that as a solution to keep world peace so something like this doesn't ever happen.
And just like
again.
anything else, these bad things come across looking good or for a good purpose. And the United Nations was brought in. Look, we don't want another world war. Let's start this United Nations.
It's all done in the name of peace.
Yeah, we'll stop the world from going to war again. Yeah, how it hasn't turned out.
In their Bible verse it says, when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh. So people need to be aware of that.
So that's Helena. Did you have any more on her? Or do you want to go on to another one here?
Well, she had a huge influence on the beginnings of the New Age movement. But really, it was Alice Bailey who came after her, who was a subsequent leader of the Theosophical Society, just like Blavatsky was. Alice Bailey, I think, had an even bigger influence, and today most frequently is referred to as the mother of the New Age movement.
All right, before we get to Alice, let me tell the folks how they can get your book. And we're going to talk about Alice Bailey, because that's a name that a lot of us have heard of. This Helena is someone I'd never heard of before. Can't even say her name. But she's a pretty important person in the history of the upbringing of Hitler.
Yeah.
And but Alice Bailey, somebody a lot of us have heard of. We're going to talk about her next. You can get your copy of Brother Gary Carr's book, and I would recommend you get this, The New World Religion. How many pages here?
Around 300.
300 and some pages. Yep. Well documented. This is a guy that documents stuff and has.
We have a thorough appendix
look at all that.
section
Look at
as
that.
well.
All these stuff in here. So go to the website, prophecynews.com. You can get your book that way with just by going online, or during regular business hours, dial the 800 number on your screen. All right, brother, let's move on here. Let's talk about Alice Bailey.
Okay, and before we do, just that Lucifer magazine copy that I showed, I want to give credit to a great researcher out of North Carolina, Dennis Cuddy. He used to work for the U.S. Department of Education, and he came across a lot of this stuff through his work there, and I was able to get that through him. And that's how the Lord's blessed us over the years, through various researchers funneling information to us. And like I said in last week's interview, I was actually involved in two of the organizations directly. So the information was funneled to me in a lot of different directions, none of which I can take credit for.
So what we're saying here is, before we get to Alice, we're saying that the global system is here. It's coming.
It's coming.
It's going to be a one world order. But this global system has as its foundation a religious backing.
Yes.
And you're saying there's some people who influenced that. This Helena was one of them that influenced Adolf Hitler. And Alice Bailey is another big character here.
Correct.
So tell us about her.
All right. Alice Bailey was a big theosophist. She was also a female Freemason, and her husband was very involved in Freemasonry. In fact, at one point in time, They were on the Masonic lecture circuit. They actually traveled around the country and spoke at some of the lodges. And according to her husband, Foster, she would go into a room, go into a trance, an altered state of consciousness, a form of occult meditation, and her spirit guide would appear to her. She had a name for this entity. She referred to him by two names, actually, Dwalkul, and sometimes she simply referred to him as the Tibetan master.
Wow.
She believed he resided in the region of Tibet, and that when she would go into an altered state, she could summon him as a spirit, and then he would communicate with her. And according to her husband, she'd go into a room, be in there for 2 or 3 days, and come out with a manuscript completely finished for a book, allegedly just dictated to her by this, what I call a demonic spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And so it should not have been a surprise to anyone when, in the early 1920s, she founded a publishing house and named it Lucifer Publishing Company. Again, if people have a hard time believing it, on page 31 of my book, I have one of the title pages from one of her first books, The Consciousness of the Atom, and down near the bottom, you can see it says Lucifer Publishing Company, 135 Broadway, New York City. Now, smartly on her part, she changed the name 2 years later to Lucis Trust. That organization still exists today. It has had quite an impact at the United Nations behind the scenes. People are not aware of that. And a lot of different political figures have had a favorable view of Lucis Trust and have moved in those circles. It may be a coincidence, it might not be a coincidence that the Council on Foreign Relations was founded around the same time in New York City, with a lot of money coming from the Rockefeller family. And behind the scenes, they helped to support a lot of organizations that were pushing this one world, interfaith, New Age agenda. But Alice Bailey, she wrote multiple books. They are today your occult classics. You can go into any bookstore. If they don't have them on the shelves, they can be ordered. I mean, they've made a huge comeback. But back in the day, you had to belong to the Theosophical Society or another related secret society to be able to get these books. They were considered off limits to the general public because they were so heavily occultic. And so in the back of my book, The New World Religion, in Appendix A, all I did was reproduce some of the quotes from Alice Bailey's books that showed how anti-Jewish and anti-Christian she was. So if there's any doubt in any people's minds, all you need to do is look at those quotes coming straight from her books. She also was a big supporter of Adolf Hitler. Yeah. And so, again, this New Age movement was right in line with the movement of the Nazis. It was actually there was a spiritual component to Nazism. And these people dabbled heavily in the occult. But then, after World War II especially, this agenda began establishing a foothold in the United States. A lot of groundwork being laid in the late 40s and early 50s and then heading into the 60s.
Yeah, and later on, I mean, it's obvious to me that the church dropped the ball. God's people dropped the ball. The preachers, the men of God of our country, have dropped the ball. They've quit preaching against sin. They've quit preaching the truth. We used to have book burnings, revivals. You've read about them. You won't hear about them anymore, but you read about them. People, I mean, all the way in the back to the book of Acts, they had them. They brought their occultic stuff and they burned them. And I've heard of that in past generations and of revivals that broke out in America. They'd burn books that were no good. They'd get rid of their Ouija boards and all that junk. Mm-hmm. That's kind of gone now, isn't it? And it seems like because we're not pushing the truth, the error has come in.
I think a lot of Christian leaders, especially back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, underestimated the hidden power of this movement. They didn't realize how powerful it already was beneath the surface. And Americans tend to react only once their backs are to the wall. If we have a major flaw, that's one of them. And so, if people would have listened even 30 years ago when I was starting to talk about this stuff and doing programs on it and warning people, and some did, thankfully, but a lot of people thought, this will never happen in the United States. And now look, the latest survey I saw, 45% of Americans now are more closely aligned with socialism than the free enterprise system. I mean, we're approaching the halfway mark. We're not far away.
I mean, we got them in Congress now. Give the folks your website so I don't forget, and
Yes.
Rex will put it on the screen. But,
Yeah, people can read some of our articles, and also we have
you have a newsletter that people can sign
yes,
up
we have a
for.
research news journal that I write articles for on a regular basis, and they can get that from our website, which is www.garycod.org. And again, my last name is spelled K-A-H.
Yep, and he'll put that up on the
All right.
screen for them. And we're not going to have enough time, but there's a couple things I don't want to miss here. Hollywood seems to be obsessed with the occult and extraterrestrials and monsters, and comment on that. Why is that?
Well, okay, a good friend of mine used to be a producer in Hollywood, and he was a co-producer of a regular series that ran for about 8 or 10 years. It was very popular. And through his experience, he is a Christian, but through his experience in Hollywood, he got to know some of the Hollywood producers. And he shared with me some of the names of the producers that had made it a mandatory requirement that people working on their creative staffs are involved in at least one form of occult meditation. And that explains a lot. You know, I've wondered for years, how in the world can even human mind even conceptualize and come up with some of these things in these occult, extraterrestrial-oriented movies? And I've concluded that if these people, if the creative staff is involved in occult meditation, they may simply be regurgitating what they are seeing on the other side when they're in their trance states. I think they're showing in these movies portions of occult visions that they are having. And so without even realizing it, a lot of people are watching demonic manifestations on their movie screens. I really believe that. And I think it's all part of a conditioning. People are so into extraterrestrials now. About 1 out of every 3 or 4 movies coming out deals with extraterrestrials or spirit beings, but people aren't making the connections. These New Agers, these one-worlders, they're smart. And so rather than calling these beings demons, they just call them extraterrestrials, because a majority of the U.S. population believes in extraterrestrials. They believe in evolution. And so the thought is, well, if we've evolved here, who's to say that there aren't higher life forms that have evolved somewhere else that can communicate to us in ways that we cannot yet comprehend?
And eventually,
and they fall for it, a demonic deception.
Maybe these extraterrestrials will come and save us.
That's what some of these people are teaching. Maybe they'll take all the
bad people off the earth.
We need to unify the world and come together to save the planet, you know, and
well, we're out of time, but my goodness,
that went
Brother
fast.
Gary, this was fun. It seems like the occult draws people. There's something exciting about it.
If I would say anything to people, I would say, remember that God is sovereign, that He is much more powerful than Satan, but we are in a spiritual battle. And we need to remember that we are on the winning team, and we need to be exposing the works of darkness so that people don't fall into these traps of the enemy.
But until next time, keep looking up.